In 1722, Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen reached one of the most isolated islands on Earth. After months at sea, his crew expected fresh water, food, and a place to repair their ships. Instead, they found hundreds of enormous stone faces. None of them were looking toward the ocean. Every single one faced the island itself. That wasn't the only thing that confused them. The island was remarkably small. Its population wasn't particularly large. There were no metal tools, no large animals to pull heavy loads, no wheels.
Yet, scattered across the landscape stood nearly 900 statues, some weighing more than a fully loaded truck. Some had never been completed, others had been abandoned halfway to their destination. It looked less like a finished civilization and more like a construction project that had suddenly stopped. For more than 2 centuries, people believed they understood why. Today, archaeologists tell a very different story. And strangely enough, the island's greatest clues weren't hidden inside temples or buried treasure. They were left in plain sight. Together, they form an ancient archive carved into stone, preserved in soil, and scattered across one of the most remote places on the planet. This is the mystery behind Easter Island that nobody can fully explain.
For decades, Easter Island became a warning. The story sounded simple enough. A growing population cut down every tree on the island to transport giant statues. Without forests, the ecosystem collapsed. Food became scarce. Violence followed. Society destroyed itself. It was such a compelling explanation that it appeared in textbooks, documentaries, and best-selling books around the world. There was only one problem. The evidence never completely matched the story.
As more excavations took place, archaeologists kept running into details that were difficult to explain if the island had truly experienced a sudden collapse. Some communities appeared to remain active longer than expected. Farming systems looked surprisingly sophisticated. Construction didn't seem as chaotic as people once imagined. The more researchers uncovered, the less certain the old explanation became, which raised a different question altogether. What kind of society would devote centuries to building monuments that served no practical purpose?
Long before Europeans arrived, Polynesian navigators had already crossed thousands of kilometers of open ocean, using nothing more than stars, currents, wind, and experience passed from one generation to the next. When they reached Rapa Nui, they found an island covered in forests, surrounded by rich fishing grounds, and filled with volcanic stone that was surprisingly easy to carve. Over time, villages developed around different parts of the island. Each community was led by powerful families who traced their ancestry back through generations. Somewhere along the way, those ancestors began taking physical form. The statues weren't portraits in the modern sense. They represented important ancestors whose presence continued long after death. Standing above each village, they reminded the living where authority came from. That's why almost every Moai faces inland. Their attention wasn't meant for strangers arriving by sea. It was meant for the people living behind them.
Every village wanted ancestors watching over its land. Every generation wanted to honor those who came before. Over centuries, one statue became dozens. Dozens became hundreds. Most of them came from a single place, a volcanic crater called Rano Raraku. Even today, hundreds of unfinished figures remain exactly where ancient workers left them. Those unfinished statues became another kind of ancient archive. They preserve every stage of construction, from rough outlines to nearly completed monuments, allowing archaeologists to reconstruct a process nobody ever wrote down. The statues tell us how they were carved. They don't tell us how they moved. And that's where the mystery becomes even stranger.
Moving one of these statues would be difficult today. The largest standing Moai weighs more than 80 tons. Most were transported several kilometers from the quarry before being placed on ceremonial platforms around the island. For a long time, researchers imagined enormous wooden sleds rolling across thick logs. It seemed like the only reasonable explanation. That idea also supported the popular collapse narrative. If thousands of trees had been cut down to move statues, the disappearance of the island's forests suddenly made sense. Then, archaeologists decided to test the assumption instead of repeating it. In 2012, a team led by archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo demonstrated something unexpected. With carefully placed ropes and coordinated movements, a replica statue could be rocked from side to side, slowly moving forward while remaining upright.
Watching the experiment, it's easy to understand why local oral traditions describe the statues as walking to their final destinations. They weren't literally walking, of course, but the movement closely resembled the stories that had survived for centuries. Not every archaeologist agrees that every moai was transported this way. Some evidence still points towards sleds or combinations of different techniques. That's part of what makes Rapa Nui so fascinating. The island continues to ask questions faster than archaeology can answer them. Along old transport routes, statues still lie exactly where they fell centuries ago. Some never reach their platforms. Others remain half-buried beside ancient roads, quietly marking journeys that were never completed. Those abandoned monuments don't suggest panic, they suggest interruption. Work continued for generations, until, gradually, it didn't. Which brings us back to the question people have argued about for more than 100 years. Why did the work stop?
For much of the 20th century, the answer seemed settled. Rapa Nui was presented as an isolated society that exhausted its own resources and collapsed before Europeans ever arrived. The deeper archaeologists dug, the less straightforward that story became. Radiocarbon dating suggested that many parts of the island remained active later than expected. Farming continued, communities adapted, construction slowed, but life didn't simply stop. Islanders had developed remarkably efficient farming methods using volcanic rock to retain moisture and protect crops from harsh winds. These weren't the actions of a society that had forgotten how to survive.
Even the disappearance of the forests became more complicated. Human activity certainly played a role, but so did another unexpected arrival, the Polynesian rat. With no natural predators, rats multiplied rapidly and fed on palm seeds, making forest regeneration increasingly difficult. Instead of one catastrophic mistake, researchers now see multiple pressures building over centuries: environmental change, population growth, shifting priorities. None of them alone explains everything. Together, they begin to paint a more convincing picture.
Then, after centuries of isolation, the outside world finally arrived. Contact brought new trade opportunities, but it also brought diseases the island had never encountered. Later came slave raids that removed hundreds of islanders, including community leaders and people who carried generations of cultural knowledge. By the late 19th century, the population of Rapa Nui had fallen to little more than 100 people. That collapse was real. It simply happened much later than many people once believed. The statues had already witnessed centuries of change before Europeans ever saw them. After that, they watched an entirely different tragedy unfold.
Archaeologists rarely solve mysteries with a single discovery. More often, they piece together hundreds of small clues that only make sense when viewed together. On Rapa Nui, almost every clue still sits where it was left centuries ago. Tool marks reveal carving techniques. Ancient roads trace transport routes. Layers of pollen preserve environmental change. Volcanic rock gardens record agricultural innovation. There are even wooden tablets covered in an undeciphered writing system known as Rongo Rongo. To this day, nobody has successfully read them with certainty. If they could, they might answer questions archaeologists are still debating, or they might introduce entirely new ones. Together, these discoveries form an ancient archive unlike almost anywhere else in the world. Not a library built from paper or clay, but one assembled from landscapes, monuments, artifacts, and fragments of everyday life. Every new survey adds another piece to the story. Every excavation reminds us how much remains uncertain. That's one reason Easter Island continues to fascinate researchers 3 centuries after Europeans first described it. The statues no longer feel like the mystery they once were. Instead, they've become witnesses, standing exactly where generations of people intended them to stand, quietly preserving the memory of a civilization that proved far more resilient than history once gave it credit for. Looking at Easter Island from above, it's easy to focus on the statues. They're enormous, unmistakable, and unlike anything else on Earth. But the real story was never carved into their faces. It was preserved in everything around them. Archaeology has a way of challenging stories that seem too neat. The longer researchers studied Rapa Nui, the more they discovered a history shaped by adaptation, uncertainty, environmental change, and encounters with the outside world, not a single dramatic collapse.
The island still keeps some of its secrets. Perhaps it always will. That's part of what makes these places worth studying.
Every excavation has the potential to rewrite what we thought we knew. Sometimes the oldest records aren't stored inside museums or libraries. Sometimes the world's greatest ancient archives are still standing exactly where they were left centuries ago, waiting for someone to ask better questions. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy uncovering history through archaeology and the world's ancient archives, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode.